So I managed to get my hands on Forspoken and play it for an hour early. Big thanks to Square Enix for inviting me to the private hands-on event where I got to try out the game on PlayStation 5, and I'm here to tell you what I experienced. I've got some things to say. Many of you will know that this is a game that I've been curious about since it was first announced, but throughout its marketing I've come to have mixed feelings about it. Things like mobility, combat, and moment-to-moment gameplay seem to show a lot of promise, but the open world, the characters, and the dialogue came across as a bit lackluster, so I was very curious to find out how I'd feel about the game after the hands-on session. And I've got to say, based on the preview build I played, I still have a lot of mixed feelings about the title. While I do feel like the game still has a lot of potential to offer entertaining gameplay, the demo just wasn't a home run for me, though it's worth keeping in mind that the game still has 4 months of development left, so a lot could get refined before then, but the basic shape of the game was there. What you're seeing here is B-roll footage, so it's not fully representative of what I experienced. The game does seem to look and run better in the B-roll, for example, but the B-roll does give us a benchmark for the kind of visual fidelity and performance that they're aiming for, at least. Now, one area that I can't give you much insight on is obviously the story and characters. This was very much a gameplay-focused demo. What I can tell you on that front is that so far, concerns surrounding the game's banter and dialogue between Frey and her Jarvis equivalent mind-blowing freaking cuffs—
oh yeah, I'm talking to a cuff—
are valid. My god, do these two talk so freaking much. I'd be more tolerant of this if the dialogue was at least, good, but it just feels like the game is constantly trying to be quippy and funny while consistently failing at it. Greatest hits include Frey saying, "Were you counting how many asses we kicked there?" Or, "I'm literally the best. I should make an effort more often." Or Frey exclaiming, "Oh my god, that was insane," after I performed a not-so-insane, pretty basic open-world mobility maneuver. Frey saying, "What do you say, kick some ass and take some names," before the cuff responds with, "Feeling a little bloodthirsty, are we?" prior to a combat encounter, and that's just like scratching the surface. I didn't write down or memorize all of them. There's just a lot of that kind of useless, unnecessary, and not clever or compelling dialogue that gives players no valuable information or no dynamic developing moments, and when that kind of dialogue is constantly and incessantly in your ear, it becomes insufferable and genuinely intolerable. It was driving me nuts. Making matters worse is how constantly and unendearingly combative and mean-spirited Frey and the Cuffs are towards each other, making both characters kind of unlikable and their dynamic unbearable. Now, the developers did say in a recent interview that they did hear the feedback surrounding this, and that players will have the option to dial the amount and frequency of in-game dialogue down, thank God. It's also entirely possible that the dynamic between Frey and the Cuffs will develop throughout the course of the campaign and become more endearing and likable, so maybe these characters and their arcs can still win me over. I'm not ruling that out. But if not, I hope the supporting cast at least offers some more nuanced, compelling, and bearable dialogue and stories. Because so far as dialogue and character dynamics go, the demo did not make a strong case. Things do take a turn for the better when focusing on moment-to-moment gameplay. One thing that I was impressed by was the sheer quantity of spells and abilities available. There are apparently over 100 spells in the game, and I had access to roughly 24 of them in this preview. Spells are accessed by bringing up selection wheels via the right and left shoulder buttons, and the respective trigger buttons activate them. The right shoulder button brings up attack spells, and the left shoulder button brings up support spells. Holding down both right and left shoulder buttons at the same time brings up a third selection wheel that allows you to cycle between schools of magic. I had access to 2 in the demo: Frey's magic, which is more sort of plant and earth-based, and Silas' magic, which is more fire-based. Switching between schools of magic will change your loadout of attack and support spells to reflect your chosen magic type. Examples for Frey's magic include attack spells like continuous shots of small rocks, slower shots of larger rocks that burst on impact, or a shield that will explode upon letting go of the trigger button, as well as support spells like erecting a plant turret that flings rocks at enemies, placing traps that explode when enemies step on them, a giant plant tendril sweep attack that damages surrounding enemies, the ability to snare enemies with plant overgrowth, creating a barrier of stones to shield from enemy attacks, the ability to cure any inflicted poison effects, and more. And then switching to Silas magic, attack spells were more melee-based, flame swords and spears and the like, and support spells feature things like the ability to erect walls of fire around you, fire magic with explosive AoE effects, the ability to summon fire swords that auto-attack enemies during combat, fire-based traps to lay around the field, a charge attack that allows you to quickly close the distance between an enemy while dealing damage, and more. On top of different schools of magic coming with their own attack and support spells, they each also come with a surge spell, which are essentially ultimate abilities triggered by pressing the left and right trigger buttons at the same time. The sheer quantity and variety of spells and the ability to string them together during combat is, I would say, the game's greatest strength right now. I did feel a bit overwhelmed at first, though. The demo just kind of threw me into the game with a bunch of spells that I wasn't acclimated to, so it took a bit to get used to swiftly switching between spells on the fly, figuring out what spells do what and what they're useful for, and just finding the best scenarios to use them, and it just took a bit before it felt like combat started to flow well. But towards the end of the demo, I did feel like I was getting the hang of it. I imagine that in the final game, spells will be introduced at a better pace so you can get used to the game's combat more gradually. Combat isn't perfect though. Melee combat in particular felt super janky in the build that I played. Animations for that felt very basic, attacks lacked a sense of impact, and the magnetism between your melee attacks and the targeted enemies just felt uncomfortably awkward and stiff. Enemy AI was also very lacking in the build that I played, with enemies often standing around and not doing a whole lot, though that may very well get ironed out in the final game. And while I did find it neat that the game encourages you to switch between schools of magic in order to exploit elemental weaknesses, I felt like you could often get away with spamming all your spells once you've selected the right magic type, instead of having to strategically consider what spells to use, though. Maybe that's a symptom of only having an hour of gameplay time and not being able to fully explore this game's combat intricacies and the ways you can really exploit the spells at your disposal. But one feature that helps bolster combat is the game's magic parkour mobility system, activated by holding down the right face button and moving around. It's kind of this sprint mode, essentially, where Frey will automatically jump over obstacles, hop over enemies, and scale walls obstructing her path, providing a lot of free reign over movement. This mobility can also be used outside of combat to swiftly navigate the open world alongside this magic rope of sorts that allows you to latch onto specific points like these crystals that allow you to pull yourself and execute large leaps, or to swing yourself across the map to cover great distances. Navigating the open world is easy and smooth enough. The magic parkour system, I'd say, works well overall. It does feel a bit tanky maybe when I want to turn while I'm parkouring around, so maybe it can smooth it out a little bit, but it was overall functioning pretty well, though it was hard to feel engaged with the world itself because it did feel kind of barren. You can do things like pick up crafting resources strewn about, you'll occasionally encounter groups of enemies you can optionally choose to fight, and there are activities strewn around here and there, but not a whole lot of dynamic things going on and not a whole lot of interesting things to look at. I do think the game does look a bit visually generic. While the graphics fidelity does look relatively AAA, there weren't any vistas that blew me away, or anything about the art style that entranced me, or anything about the visuals around me that encouraged me to stop in my tracks just to take the view in. It's no, Witcher 3 or Horizon Forbidden West on that front. But then again, I only had access to a small portion of the game world, so maybe my opinion on that will change when I explore everything the world has to offer in the final release. I also wasn't impressed by the game's performance, specifically on PlayStation 5, which at 4K resolution with ray tracing on felt a bit stuttery and not particularly smooth, even by 30 FPS standards. I was encouraged to turn on all the graphical whistles in the options, but this may have been to the demo's detriment. I would have liked to play this in a performance mode of sorts, though performance is one area that does get fleshed out towards the last leg of development, and in the B-roll we do see the game running and looking much better, so if they can target that and achieve that, then great. So this is one area where I won't judge too harshly 4 months out before launch, but I do hope there is a 60 FPS performance mode, given the frenetic nature of Forspoken's combat that necessitates smooth gameplay and smooth open-world traversal performance. But beyond the visuals, what open-world activities I did encounter weren't all that compelling in my experience, though that may be due to the limited scope of this incomplete build. Maybe in the final game I'll find much more varieties of activities and ones that feel much more engaging. So outside of the demo's main objectives, I found activities like treasure chests that ask you to solve very basic puzzles to open and loot them. I found these monuments that would teleport me to a confined challenge area where I'd have to do things like defend villagers from enemy hordes for a couple minutes, which honestly was so basic in its design, with villagers just kind of standing still and doing nothing, and enemy hordes spawning at a weird and intermittent pace in a very generic and bland battle arena, that I got bored of it fairly quickly and I felt like it lasted too long. But I did get an increase to my base stats for completing the challenge, which is what monuments, as they're called in this game, do. And these more extraneous side activities felt pretty basic and felt kind of very quickly thrown together. As for the main objectives, they did feel a bit more substantial and a bit more handcrafted. The demo featured 5 main objectives with a 6th extra one for me to pursue. Objective 1 involved me just going to a refuge to rest and resupply. These are essentially safe houses where you'll have access to a bed to rest and heal up, a crafting table to craft consumable items, and to increase the capacity of medicine and crafting material pouches, as well as upgrade your gear, which consists of cloaks and necklaces with varying effects and cosmetic differences and stat increases. And these cloaks and necklaces can be found throughout the world as you complete objectives and activities, or as you loot treasures and the like. There's also a spell crafting area in safe houses where you can unlock and upgrade spells, and more. I am very curious to see how much character build variety the game will allow. It's hard to say with just 1 hour of hands-on time, but the main character stats you'll focus on are a combination of base character stats plus equipment stats layered on top that can be bolstered through the crafting table by upgrading equipment. On top of stats, both cloaks and necklaces also have numerous passive effects that can be applied to them, such as improved critical hit rate when your HP is high, reduced damage when you block with your cuffs and have full stamina, temporary boost to defense when healing items are used, boost to surge magic recharge rate depending on the number of enemies you're battling, and more. Layered on top of all that are the nails equipment, which not only come in varied cosmetic designs, but also offer various passive effects to further help shape your character build. I didn't have enough time to really experiment with Frey's character builds, but I hope it's less mindless and just, kind of you can get away with throwing together whatever you want, and more like you can deliberately shape Frey to play very differently depending on what you equip. Moving on, Objective 2 involved defeating a bunch of enemies as well as some mini-bosses on a bridge, and this is where I really got to play around and experiment with unleashing spells and feeling some of that power fantasy. You do have to be active about dodging enemy attacks, and you do have to pay attention to your surroundings, but as I previously mentioned, overall enemy AI generally felt pretty brain dead and like it still needed a lot of work, and I hope this is one area where the game will improve dramatically in the final release. While I do enjoy good power fantasy and how powerful this game makes me feel, I feel like enemies do still need to offer enough of a challenge to keep players on their toes, to hold their attention, and to add a sense of tension to combat. And in the demo, I just felt like I was kind of plowing through enemies, so hopefully they can balance that out. I also did find that how flashy the game's spells can be visually obtrusive at times. Sometimes there's just so many particle effects bursting at once that it's hard to tell what's going on, so that's something that hopefully I can get used to in the final game with more extensive play sessions, or something that the developers can find a way to dial down. From there, Objective 3 involved going to a location called Rosewood Fountain, where after a cutscene showing Frey absorbing some kind of power, I learned a new spell called Surge, which allows me to climb higher walls with magic parkour. So points of interest where you're going to learn new spells are things to look forward to in the open world. And then Objective 4 was another stat increase objective, which guided me towards another monument called Monument of Strength that increased my base defense stat by +5. Finally, Objective 5 involved me finding a treasure chest guarded by enemies that I had to defeat before being able to loot the new cloak that the chest housed. The demo then surprised me with a 6th extra objective, which involved me fighting a tougher boss enemy roaming the open world, this giant fire crocodile lizard looking thing. And while this was among the more epic encounters in the demo, I didn't find it to be particularly challenging. I dodged and repositioned where I needed to here and there, but generally I was just kind of spamming all my spells as they cooled down, and that just kind of did the trick. Again, as much as I appreciate the quantity and variety of spells, I hope the final game will feel less mindless in the way in which my spells are deployed. I hope combat can feel just a bit more strategic and a bit more deliberate, and maybe that can be achieved with a combination of difficulty options that may be available in the final game, alongside adjusted difficulty curves and maybe tweaks to mechanical aspects to the game that will force players to be more deliberate about their spell choices. Unleashing a bunch of spells at once is fun a few times, but when there's no intention behind the choices you're making with the spells you have, It can feel more like you're just kind of mashing buttons and less like you're skillfully executing sequences. So my overall takeaway from this Forspoken hands-on demo is that the moment-to-moment mobility, combat, and gameplay is what's currently shining brightest and what has the most potential, as long as certain elements surrounding it like enemy AI, strategic spell usage, and melee combat are improved and refined. The open world activities and the overall visuals and performance of the game left something to be desired, and then from there the worst offender was the incessant in-game dialogue and banter, as well as character dynamics that were just complete turn-offs. Though when it comes to story and characters, I feel like I have to experience the whole game to really gauge what they're going for here, the tone, and whether these characters will end up growing on me, and whether this is just a bad first impression that will eventually warm up to me over time. We'll see what happens. For now, I'm not sold that the game will be a must-have when it finally launches, but I do believe that the developers have plenty of time to refine and adjust the areas that I had qualms with, and I do see glimmers of great potential, so if they use these 4 months effectively, you know, it may very well change my mind about whether this is a game that everyone should play or not. But currently, I'm going to say that I'm cautious about my excitement for this game based on the preview build that I got to check out. But I still remain curious to see how it improves, and I am curious to give it a go when it launches on January 2023 and report back on what I think about the final game. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is my hands-on impressions of the 1 hour that I got to play of Forspoken. Thank you for tuning in, folks. For more gaming news and coverage, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. With that, I will see you guys next time. Young out.